December 17th, 1944, just after 11:30 in the morning, on the edge of the Belgian village of Krinkelt, a machine gunner named Jose Lopez picks up his weapon, alone, and carries it across open ground from one side of his company's line to the other. He isn't ordered to do this. Nobody tells him the flank is about to collapse. He sees it happening, decides on his own that this is where he needs to be, and walks into it carrying a gun that weighs over 30 pounds, into a fight that, on paper, one man with a machine gun does not survive. By the time that fight is finished, roughly 6.5 hours later, Sergeant Jose Mendoza Lopez will be credited with killing more enemy soldiers, alone, than almost any other American serviceman in the entire war, and the flank he refused to abandon will have held just long enough for his entire company to get out alive. This isn't a story that needs any embellishment to sound unbelievable. It's documented in an official U.S. Army Medal of Honor citation, cross-checked against the unit history of the 2nd Infantry Division and the German records of what was hitting that line that morning. And what makes it worth telling in detail isn't just the killing, it's the specific, almost mechanical series of decisions one man made, alone, under fire, that turned a single machine gun into the reason an entire company didn't get overrun. And to understand what Lopez actually walked into that morning, you have to understand what had happened along this stretch of the front the day before. On December 16, 1944, and Germany launched the opening assault of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, its largest offensive in the West since 1940. In the sector around the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath sat directly in the path of some of the most experienced and heavily armed German formations committed to the attack, including elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, a unit built around a core of fanatically indoctrinated young soldiers, and led by battle-hardened veterans who had fought across multiple fronts of the war. For the American 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions holding this ground, in December 16th and the early hours of the 17th were a running fight simply to avoid being overrun entirely, as German tanks and infantry pushed forward faster than anyone on the American side had time to fully react to. This is exactly the kind of story that gets buried under the bigger, more famous names of this battle. Bastogne gets the headlines. But the fighting at Krinkelt-Rocherath in these same first hours decided just as much. If you want the rest of what one man did here, subscribe so you don't miss part 2, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. By the morning of the 17th, Company K of the 23rd Infantry Regiment and 2nd Infantry Division was holding a position near Krinkelt that was about to take the full weight of that advance directly. German infantry, supported by tanks, was pushing hard against the company's right flank, the kind of pressure that, left unanswered for even a few minutes, turns an organized withdrawal into a rout. Lopez, a machine gunner already in position on a different part of the line, saw what was happening to that flank before anyone gave him an order to fix it. It's what he did next, carrying his gun across open ground to a shallow hole that gave him no cover above the waist, and opening fire on an advancing enemy force with nothing but his own judgment about where the line actually needed to hold, is where this story stops being a general account of a chaotic battle and becomes the specific record of one soldier's action, minute by minute, that the U.S. Army later verified closely enough to award its highest decoration for valor. The position Lopez chose to defend Company K's threatened flank offered him almost nothing. A shallow depression in the ground, low enough that anything above his waist stood exposed to whatever was coming at him. He set the machine gun up anyway, sighted in on the nearest cluster of advancing German infantry, and opened fire. And 10 men went down in the first burst, the leading edge of the assault that had been about to fold onto his company's undefended side. That should have been the end of it. And 10 men is already more than most soldiers in this war would ever be credited with in a single engagement, let alone from a position offering no real cover. But the attack didn't stop, and neither did Lopez. A German tank somewhere in the advancing line began firing in his direction, close enough that the concussion from near misses was throwing dirt and debris over his position. He stayed where he was. As more German infantry worked their way around to try to turn the flank from a different angle, he tracked them and fired again. 25 more men down, according to the account later verified for his Medal of Honor citation, and brought to the ground by a soldier who, by this point, had been under direct tank fire for several minutes with nothing over his head but Belgian sky. Then one round landed close enough to lift him off the ground. A concussion from that blast, an artillery round or tank shell, close enough to physically move a grown man through the air, is the kind of moment that ends most soldiers' involvement in a fight, whether from wounds or simply from the disorientation of surviving something like that. Lopez got back up. He reset the machine gun. He kept firing from the same exposed position, because the flank he'd walked over to protect still needed protecting, and nothing about being thrown backward by an explosion had changed that fact. What happened next is the part of this story that turns it from a single remarkable stand into something closer to a running defense conducted almost entirely on Lopez's own judgment about where his gun needed to be next. Realizing his position was again in danger of being outflanked, he picked the weapon back up, a machine gun that weighed over 30 pounds even without its tripod and ammunition, and carried it alone to a new position to the right rear of the sector, where German tanks and infantry were now pressing hard enough that the rest of Company K was being forced into a withdrawal. He set up again. He kept the enemy off his company's back while that withdrawal happened, and buying the time his fellow soldiers needed to disengage from a fight that had already turned against them everywhere else on the line. When that position, too, became untenable, Lopez did the same thing a third time. He found a handful of other soldiers from his unit, attempting to organize a last defensive line against the German advance, joined them, and kept firing until his ammunition ran out entirely. Only then, and with nothing left to fire and his own unit's position collapsing around him, did he fall back with what remained of his group toward Krinkelt itself. Still carrying the machine gun he'd hauled across 3 separate firing positions, over roughly 6.5 hours of continuous combat. The official count, later confirmed for his Medal of Honor citation, puts the number of enemy soldiers Lopez killed that day at more than 100. A figure investigators cross-checked against the accounts of the men who fought alongside him and the physical evidence left on the ground his positions had covered. And what that number represented in practical terms wasn't just a body count. It was the difference between Company K being enveloped and destroyed on December 17th and Company K making it out of Krinkelt intact enough to fight again days later on the ridge the Americans would end up holding for the rest of the battle. And Company K bought at Krinkelt on December 17th fed directly into something larger happening across the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive that week. As the fighting at Krinkelt-Rockerath ground on, American forces from the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions withdrew in stages to a stretch of high ground a few kilometers to the rear known as Elsenborn Ridge. And it was there, not at Krinkelt itself, that the German advance in this sector was finally and permanently stopped. Elsenborn Ridge would go on to become the one section of the entire northern shoulder of the Bulge that German forces never managed to break throughout the whole 6 weeks of the battle. Every company, every squad, every gun that made it out of Krinkelt intact instead of being overrun, there was one more piece of the defense that held that ridge. That's the part of this story that's easy to lose in the drama of one man and one machine gun. Lopez's stand wasn't an isolated act of heroism sitting apart from the larger battle. It was one link in the specific chain of decisions and sacrifices that let the American line reform on ground the Germans could never dislodge them from afterward. And Cetum. Military historians studying the Ardennes campaign have pointed to the fighting withdrawal from Krinkelt-Rockerath as one of the decisive actions of the entire opening phase of the battle, not because it stopped the German attack outright, but because it turned what could have been a rout into an organized retreat to better ground, at a cost the Germans could not sustain fast enough to matter. For his actions that day, Sergeant Jose Mendoza Lopez was awarded the Medal of Honor and presented to him on June 18, 1945, in a ceremony in Nuremberg, Germany, by Major General James Van Fleet. He became the 4th American of Mexican descent to receive the nation's highest award for valor. When he returned home to the United States, he was given a hero's welcome that included a personal greeting from New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. A level of public recognition that, for a Mexican immigrant who had crossed into Texas as a teenager riding freight trains to find work, it marked an unusual moment of the country he'd fought for publicly claiming him as one of its own. Lopez's own path to that machine gun position at Krinkelt had nothing dramatic or predestined about it. Born in 1910, orphaned young, he had spent years before the war doing seasonal farm labor across the country and working briefly as a professional boxer, before eventually joining the U.S. Merchant Marine and later being drafted into the Army in 1942. Nothing in that record marked him out in advance as a man who would one day be credited with single-handedly killing more enemy soldiers than almost any other American in the war. What the record actually shows is closer to something else. A soldier who, in the specific minutes when his company's flank was about to collapse, made a series of individual choices under fire that nobody ordered him to make, and kept making them long after most men would have judged that they'd already done enough. He carried that machine gun to 3 different firing positions over roughly 6.5 hours. He got up after being thrown to the ground by a blast that could easily have ended the fight for him permanently. He stayed in position with nothing over his waist for cover while a tank fired in his direction. None of that was written into any order given to him that morning. All of it came from a decision he kept making, over and over, about where the line actually needed to hold. Lopez went on to live for decades after the war, eventually working for U.S. Customs and later for the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and remained a prominent figure in Mexican-American veterans communities until his death in 2005. Schools, a U.S. Army Reserve Center, and a bridge on the U.S.-Mexico border in his native region have since carried his name, a quieter and longer kind of recognition than the single afternoon at Krinkelt that earned it, but one that traces directly back to those 6.5 hours in the Belgian snow. What the record actually supports, in the end, isn't a story that needed any exaggeration to be worth telling. A machine gunner saw his company's flank about to be overrun, decided on his own that he was the one who had to fix it, and kept deciding that, position after position, and long after any reasonable measure of duty had already been met. The Army verified the details closely enough to award its highest decoration. The ridge his stand helped make possible held for the rest of the battle. That's the whole of it, and it doesn't need anything added to land.